Hey, you are now listening to the Graceway podcast. Let's talk.
And hey there, everybody. Welcome to this podcast that we call Let's Talk, that's produced by Graceway in Kansas City, Missouri. My name is Jeff Adams, and I'm again sitting here this morning with my favorite pastor, Pastor Tim Dunn. And we have been going through the entire Bible this year, and I know many of you have followed with us faithfully every Sunday, or almost every Sunday. You may be listening to us on Friday at 3 in the morning, but this is from Pastor Tim's Sunday morning services. And today, we were dealing with Elisha, right?
Yeah.
And I was very excited. I love the character of Elisha, and I love the way that you dealt with him, because we can look at him and think, man, this is the guy that called fire down from heaven.
Yeah.
How could I possibly relate to that?
Yeah, right.
But really the power of the story is in how much we are like him.
Yeah, that's right.
And I thought you brought that out well this morning. Let me ask you a question to start off with, because you were dealing with the overall theme of spiritual warfare,
Sure.
how we get depleted and the enemy attacks us and whatnot. So having been in your spot a few times, did you battle to come up with this message on spiritual warfare?
I did not. No. I think there's battle around the intent to talk about it. But I think there's battle. I think that it kind of came to the surface pretty quickly. You start at the famous story, calling down from fire. And, You know, it's from a preaching standpoint, it's a little bit of a dangerous text, because what's the application, right? Like, have faith like Elijah, and what, So it's not, you can get into moralism and faulty expectation pretty quickly. But the story under the bloom tree or juniper tree is incredibly accessible.
I think that's the advantage of you taking us through the Bible in a year.
Yeah, right.
We're not looking at every chapter and verse.
Right.
And I think so many times when we look at the life of Elisha, who's a larger-than-life character in the Bible, we tend to divide the two stories today that you put together.
Yeah.
And really the application comes from the bookmark of these two stories.
It does, yeah. And, I mean, it's not, it's proper exegetically, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's in the same week of his life, essentially. But the dichotomy of his experience and his response is it feels pretty stark as you're reading it. But then when you think about your own journey and your own story, you say, well, maybe maybe it's not that stark. Maybe it's just being a human being and trying to sort out spiritual attack and supernatural provision, and maybe it's very, very, very relevant. So.
Well, you made the great point that it's not the size of our faith, it's the object of our faith.
Yeah.
And preventing us from seeing if we can muster up enough faith to call down fire from heaven.
That's right.
But you also said something that I think so needed to be said, because there are those of us, and I put myself in that category because I'm just as weak in faith as the next guy.
Yeah, sure.
But we look at stories like Elisha calling down fire from heaven, and the tendency to say, but God doesn't do things like that today.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. How do we answer ourselves, Pastor Tim? I'm not even asking how to answer other people. I'm saying, how do we deal with that ourselves when we look at that and say, well, I've never seen God literally bring down fire from heaven? What does that look like today?
Yeah, I'm probably gonna get myself in trouble here. That's okay. I mean, for me, it starts with kind of what people are being taught and these frameworks they're being taught around, supernatural events, and it's a very reactionary kind of thing for preachers, right? Preachers are nervous about over expectation of ecstatic events and experiences.
Yes.
They're one or the other, right? They're either nervous about it or they're in pursuit of it, and these two shall never meet and constantly reference one another. We would be more cautious side around that. But sometimes in our zeal to manage people's expectations, I think we overstate what God does and doesn't do anymore. And I think it's a pretty dangerous spot when you begin using expectation, theology, history, whatever it is, to say what God does or doesn't do anymore.
Yeah, you and I both love to read
Yeah.
church history.
Yeah.
We love to talk about and study about what has happened. And
Yeah.
it seems like somewhere in the middle of the last century, we
Yeah.
became so intellectualized in our faith
That's right.
that we put God in boxes.
Yeah.
This is what God can do. This is
Yeah.
what God is not allowed to do.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And we don't say it like that, but the expectation in people is that. So I think you have to start with God does whatever he wants.
Yeah.
Our part in that is to be seeking God, knowing God, enjoying God, and responding to God. And so we don't spin God up with our good behavior to induce some type of miraculous thing. That's not how it is.
Right.
But we also want to put ourselves in a posture of humility and receptivity to whatever God is going to do, and whether that be fireball from heaven or the compulsion to forgive somebody that we don't want to forgive. We think one is miraculous and the other isn't, but that's not how the Bible talks about it.
Yeah.
Me all of a sudden feeling compelled to forgive somebody that's deeply hurt and betrayed me sure feels like a fireball from heaven to me.
Yeah.
And
For sure.
And so I think that we have to make sure that we are not in the predicting what God can do business. We are in the following God business, and I think that sometimes we think Elijah wasn't, but Elijah was in the following God business, and that's what he says in his prayer.
Yeah.
Hey, you're the one that told me to do this.
Right.
He wasn't making that up on his own.
Yeah.
He wasn't throwing a spiritual lure in the water and hoping God would bite. He was doing what God told him to do.
Yeah.
And the same is true today. Do it. I read one guy, he said, do the will of God, not the work of God.
Mm.
And sometimes we want to do God's part. Like, this is what it would look like for you to do what you're supposed to do, God.
Mm-hmm.
That's not my spot. My spot is to do the will of God. And however God chooses to work is up to him.
You've used the word in the 5 minutes or so we've been talking expectations several times.
Yeah.
By the way, I loved the Brene Brown quote that
really
expectations are really just pre-assigned resentments.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that is so true.
In every context.
From the great theologian Brene Brown.
That's exactly right.
Which is interesting because I just finished reading a book this last week by a Buddhist.
Okay.
And you and I both like to read a variety of things.
We do.
And I'm not converting to Buddhism, by the way. I just want to be clear about that. But it's interesting what we can learn from each other. And one of the points that the person was making is this need to simply approach life and God, our faith, with open hands rather than fixed expectations.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that's what I heard you say this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just, and we have talked about this on this podcast, we strip these characters of their humanity.
Yeah.
We think about them one-dimensionally, at best two-dimensionally. This would have been a terrifying thing for Elijah. He's got all this moxie and all this swag. We kind of just think, he's fine. No, he was putting everything on the line in this moment and would have been conscious and cognizant of what was at stake. Mm-hmm. The thing that is different about Elijah is that he appears to have been more concerned about what was at stake for God than himself. Mm-hmm. And seems to, a lot of these guys, they're so committed to, I'll go back to the same phrase, to God's will in their life. And they have figured out a way to be along for the ride. I'm not good at that. I have expectations going in. I have expectations. If I do this, you owe me this. If I do this, you owe me this. If I do this, you owe me that. And it's a really presumptuous place to be. It's a bondage place to be for us. Mm-hmm. God just isn't going to do it our way, match our expectations. And I do think, going back to the text, there was something in Elijah that he had an expectation that didn't come to pass. Mm-hmm. Like something spun him out. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it was his expectations of God, his expectations of himself, how it was going to feel, what was going to happen next. He says this thing about I'm worse than my fathers.
Yeah.
Which is an
interesting statement.
Yeah. So I don't know if he thought there was going to be a greater revival. I don't know. But even for him, baked into it was something didn't happen that he thought could or should happen. And it did spin him out. I didn't have time. That hit the editing floor. But I spent a lot of time thinking about that. What happened to this guy?
Yeah, that's such a fascinating thought,
Yeah.
one that I'm sure we'll never define in this
Yeah.
lifetime.
Yeah.
But what I loved about your approach today, and the reason why I was so encouraged that you put both stories together, is in a short period of time, Elisha experienced things that you and I have experienced so many times.
Absolutely.
Depletion,
Yeah.
tired, hungry, depressed, all of these things that we could throw out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so whatever it was that triggered him, to use a contemporary word,
Yeah.
those factors all contributed to us.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Talk into that a little bit more. The things that you were saying this morning, you were giving us a clinic on how to deal with these things.
Well, I think you have to start with this incredible man of God got to a spot where he was suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
And those two things are not in opposition to one another.
No, and you have experienced that personally with friends.
I have, yes.
We both have.
Yep. And so we just have to regularly say, sadness is a part of the human condition, and sometimes sadness stays, and sometimes sadness produces other things, biologically, circumstantially, and spiritually. Charles Spurgeon, there's a great book, Spurgeon's Sorrows by Zach Eswine. Mm-hmm. And Charles Spurgeon had an event. He was preaching in like one of the largest spots that he had ever preached, and somebody in the audience yelled fire.
Yeah.
And thousands of people all tried to get out of the building. A couple of people died. A lot of people got wounded, and he got crushed in the press. And went into a season where his wife said he nearly lost his sanity, almost went crazy. And so he talks a lot about depression, a lot. And he says there's three types: circumstantial,
mm-hmm.
Biological,
mm-hmm.
and spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of lump them all into one thing,
right?
Some melancholy. And I think it's wise for us to continue to talk about it, and it's wise for us to be specific about it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first thing. The second, 2, 3, 4, is just the way that God dealt with Elijah. He did not come with facts. Mm-hmm. He did not come with theology. He did not come with pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah.
He came and let him sleep, came and fed him, came and let him vent.
Right.
Came and let him, gave him some good news. Yeah. Came and let him, walk it off, take a walk. That was my. But when people are in that spot, they need mercy.
Mm.
They need mercy, and we find that in God.
We do. I'm listening to you talk, and I'm reflecting back on what I just mentioned, that just not that long ago, you lost a friend who was a powerful man of God.
Very much.
Who, for whatever reason, took his own life.
Yep.
One of our predecessors, a pastor in this church decades ago, in a moment of despair, took his own life after being used greatly of God.
Yep.
And I think sometimes we look at characters like Elisha in the Bible and make them larger than life. And I think sometimes people look at spiritual leaders and make them larger than life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when we believe that, that's when we are on the wrong path.
Yeah, when we believe that, and when we believe that, that's when we're on the wrong path. Yeah, I had a dear friend, father of 4, So there's lots of ways that we could come at this. God's way versus our way, God's perspective versus our perspective. It is so instructive, though, to me.
But let me mention something else that you said that I think is really key to this.
Please.
As you talked about Elisha, one of the warning signs that you pointed out to us this morning was in this time of crushed expectations and depression and whatnot, his natural reaction, as is ours, was to isolate.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the more important things. Now, you made application to small groups.
I did. Sure.
But which is one of the great resources that we have.
Yeah, one of.
But I guess the point is, when people are going through a time like that, you need the help of other people. If you're depressed, get help.
Yeah. and help can come in the professional sense, and help can come just in the friend sense.
Well, exactly. And sometimes in churches we tend to spiritualize everything.
Yeah, right.
We forget the biological depression or the circumstantial. Everything is spiritual.
Sure.
And everything is spiritual at its base.
Of course. Yeah.
But yet the entire universe is God.
Yeah.
He works through medicine. He works through science. He
right.
works through people who don't even know him.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, toward the sequence for Elijah was, fear, overreaction and underreaction, and then isolation. That's kind of the spin out for him. And I think it's the same for us. Something happens that maximizes and gives us this over-exaggerated or under-exaggerated perspective on something that happens, creates all of these emotions. And when we don't have friendships or won't avail ourselves of those friendships, because there's two sides to it. Some people don't have friendships and they are isolated. Some people have friendships and they choose to isolate.
That's right. They choose to cut themselves off instead of opening up.
That's right. Or they'll be guarded with information. Or,
exactly.
And it's impossible to overstate how incredibly damaging that is.
We all have to have people that we can be totally honest with and know that we'll not be judged.
That's exactly right.
And you and I have talked about that on many occasions.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that we have really talked about. Let me change gears here. This is another weird thought I had as I'm listening to you today. You're talking about Elisha's reactions and how he began to focus on the events, focus on the threat to his life, focus on his depletion, depression, and all of that, rather than remembering what had just happened.
Yeah, that's right.
And when you said that, my thought went back to the beginning of our time in church this morning when we remembered the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
And it just seems to me sometimes that things like the Lord's Supper are far more important than we've ever thought.
Agreed. I think especially as culture gets further away, not that this building has any, significance to it outside of the history and the relationships in it, but when you leave this building and the relationships represented in it, you're getting an earful, a soulful, and that the more divided, the more broken our country, culture, city, neighborhood gets, the more important it is to call God's people back to remembrance. And that it's interesting because God walks Elijah, take a walk, where you want me to go? Sinai, right? What? It's where it all began.
Right.
Like I started this with my people, son, and I will see this through with my people. Perspective.
Right.
Remembrance gives us perspective.
Yes.
And the Lord's Supper gives us perspective. And we don't think that we're walking around with a perspective or that we're influenced by perspectives. And so what the church has to do is remind of events, remind of promises, remind of truths to help combat perspective and perspectives. Because if COVID taught us anything, those outside perspectives bear undue influence in our life, and can be really destructive if we are not open-hearted, open-minded enough to bring them to relationship.
And that's precisely another point that I wanted to bring up, because all through your message today, you were making reference to COVID and how that has depleted us as a people. And you and I have talked about this on several occasions, and I've heard your aching pastor heart when you see people who at one time were totally connected who have isolated. And what I heard you saying today was, it's time to get back together.
It's been time. It's been time. And I say that with all due respect and acknowledgement of complexity and fears and health and all those kind of things. But the longer people take to re-engage, let's call it, the more it damages everyone.
It does.
It really does. And people, we think that I just have developed new routines and habits, and nobody ever says, are they better? Are they better habits?
Is it working?
Is it working? And, when somebody says, oh, I just don't think I need that anymore, or doing other things, nobody ever questions it. Because the source of the genesis of the thing was COVID and traumatic and all. And so we feel we feel both defensive and insecure about pushing on somebody's where they've landed.
And I guess one of the things we ought to mention, because one thing happened to Graceway during COVID, is you led your team very creatively to find new ways to reach out and to connect with people. And I think it's safe to say that we have every week thousands of people online listening to you through streaming, or they hear this podcast. People from all around the globe, literally. And I think it's safe to say that we need to remind them that what we're trying to do is not to get people to build up one church in Kansas City called Graceway, but if somebody's listening today, they've cut themselves off from the body of Christ. They need to get back.
They need to get back. Get back to your local body. Now, listen all you want, here, there, and everywhere. And we'll continue. We have another one. She is our executive pastor's wife, Ann Baxter, interviews and gets stories of ladies of Graceway. It's awesome. We're going to continue to try to be creative with the podcast medium. But, if you are in whatever, Seattle and watching us, thanks for watching us. Find a local church.
Exactly.
We aren't your church. We cannot uphold the promises that we make to our local members, to you. We can't.
But we are all part of the church.
We are all part of the church, and if you can't find a church, call us, and we'll help you find a church. But you need a local expression, a flesh and blood expression. This is only intended to be gravy if you're outside of Kansas City. But you need to be in a local church, and maybe the church that you were going to doesn't exist anymore, or I don't want to say they changed and I don't agree with them, because I hear that so often. Well, figure it out. Have a conversation. Do we
have to agree about everything?
Exactly. Do we have to agree about everything? But so I want to be specific and say, find a local, growing, fruit-bearing church. You don't need to find a church that's perfectly to your liking. You need to find a church you can grow in. You can bring glory to God in, and if you don't agree, have conversations and grow.
Is that not what we do with God? We create God after our image.
We do.
And it seems like we try to do that with the church. I want the church that I think the way that it ought to be.
I think we try to do it with almost everything.
Exactly.
Exactly. And I think we're getting, tribalism is basically that, right? My life created in my image, my likings, politically, aesthetically, recreationally, and philosophically, theologically,
it's kind of crazy. Well, Pastor Tim, it is always great to have these talks. I love it. I can't always be here. You can't always be here. I can't
always be here,
But it's always refreshing to me to be able to come in and kind of analyze a little bit of what we've heard. I think I've said this before. You're my favorite preacher. And so I miss it when you're not here. I miss it when I'm not here. And so excited about it. Where are we headed next in the Bible story?
Same as last week. I have a couple of different things. It's interesting now we're heading into the prophets and a little bit deeper into the historic narrative. So I have a couple of things that I'm kind of trying to knock around.
All right. We'll just wait with bated breath. And thanks to all of you for being with us today on Let's Talk. And let me remind you, you can subscribe to Let's Talk. You can like Let's Talk wherever you get your podcast, whether it's on the Graceway website or social media, whether it's Spotify, Apple, Google, you name it, we're there. And we will look to see you there. And we will be right back here, same place next week.
Thanks for tuning into the Graceway Experience. Hope we can talk again sometime.